From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Peggy Pearlstein, head of the Hebraic section here in the African and Middle Eastern Division of the Library of Congress. Welcome to today's program, where Dr. Aklilu Habte, former president of the Haile Selassie First University, will speak about the history of education in Ethiopia with an emphasis on higher education. Again, thank you for coming, and here is Venta.
Thank you, Peggy. Good afternoon and welcome to this event. I have a couple of announcements to make for the subsequent programs we will be having. There is one on November 9, and Mr. Masaratu Wende, a freelance artist, Ethiopian artist, will be speaking on contemporary Ethiopian church art. And there will be a December 9 event, and subsequently there will be another one on January also. I will pass a piece of paper so that you can list your names for me and emails so that I can reach you whenever these events are, remind you when these events are happening or before they happen. And it's also, I would like also all of you to remind you that you should check our website for subsequent events that are happening in the division. There are so many programs listed. And today we have a special guest, Dr. Aklilu Habte, who has been an educator all of his life. And I should say that no one qualifies better than him to give this lecture about Ethiopia, education in Ethiopia, and especially with emphasis on higher education. I'll now just read a brief biography of Dr. Aklilu. Dr. Aklilu Habte combines 36 years of academic, managerial, and international civil service experience from 1958 till 1994, and 15 years of selective consultancy services, civil society organizations, and diaspora community volunteer activities. From 1990 to 1993, he served UNICEF as chief of the education division and special advisor to the executive director. Dr. Aklilu served the World Bank from 1977 to 1987 as the Director of Education and Training Department, and from 1987 to 1990 as Special Advisor in Human Resources Development to the Vice President of the Africa region. From 1958 to 1974, he was with Haile Selassie First University, first as a lecturer in education, then as head of Education Department, as Dean of the Faculty of Arts and of Education, as Associate Academic Vice President, and lastly, as President of the University from 1969 to 1974. At this point, I would like to interject and add that it was at this time that I was a third-year college student under his presidency. I must add also that it was a time of student turmoil and uprising in campuses. There were serious confrontations between the university administration, law enforcement officers, and the students. However, Dr. Aklilu withstood the pressure from the students and the government and survived. I must admit that he is a man of courage and a man of great moral fortitude. Dr. Aklilu Habte has served and continues to serve on numerous boards and international organizations. He is currently in the process of completing a book in Amharic regarding the development of higher education in Ethiopia, with emphasis on the history of Haile Selassie First University. I now call upon Dr. Aklilu Habti to give his presentation.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much, Fanta, for your introduction. And let me start by thanking this library and the staff for the wonderful job you are doing for people like me that are interested in some facts, and you have always been ready to accommodate our requests. You've done it on time, and you've been very tireless as far as I'm concerned. So I want to thank the chief of the division and the staff for this kind of services. For you're presiding over a store of knowledge in this place, and I think making it available to interested people is a wonderful contribution you are making. I've been asked to say a few words in half an hour. I have in mind a period of some 4,000 or 5,000 years that I have to cover in half an hour. So now you do the ratio. So what I decided to do is to be selective and to make sure that I avoid statistics, figures, which you could find anywhere here. So I'll try to emphasize largely on issues and problems that arose in the development of education in Ethiopia, and even those very selectively. During questions and answers, I'll be happy, which I enjoy, which I feel is probably more important than my contribution. That is the period when we begin to interact. I assume you all know where Ethiopia is. Because often when I'm asked to give some talks to school systems in this country, where I have now lived a long time, which is my second home, when I ask the students where is Ethiopia, I often get all kinds of answers. Most of them, it's somewhere in Mississippi, and to some of them it's in Canada, and to some of them it's rarely somewhere in Africa, and to some of them it's even in Europe. But I do not expect this group of audience to feel that way, so I assume you know where Ethiopia is. I want to make 4 general statements that have broad implications for the development of education and cultural development in Ethiopia, just as a background. The first one, which you all know, is the geographic location of Ethiopia. Because where it is, it has had connections for a long time, for millennia. West Africa, Ethiopia towards West Africa, have had people with whom I have interacted in Mali and other places where they have told me all kinds of stories, how people have come from a far land, mountainous land, and they had come and settled there, and how people from Western Africa have gone through Ethiopia and settled in Sudan and in Ethiopia. In particular, after the rise of Islam, people used to come to go to Mecca, and on the way, somehow they have settled in Sudan and in Ethiopia and lived there forever. And some of them go to Mecca, on their way back they settled there. So this kind of historic interaction has been going on through West Africa. The other way is through Eastern Africa, through the Arabian Peninsula, as far as India and Indonesia, where many people speak of the slave movements. Usually the emphasis is as if all had taken place from West Africa, but that's not true. A large number of slaves have left from Ethiopia eastward to the Arabian Peninsula, India, and Indonesia, and the Arab countries in that area. In fact, most of the well-thought African historians think that close to half of the slavery had gone through Eastern Africa. But that's not only slavery. A large number of Ethiopians and Africans have been recruited as brave soldiers to fight in the Indian Peninsula. I mean, that part is fascinating. For those of you that do not know it, that part is fascinating, and historians are now opening the door, how people have gone from Uganda, Ethiopia, and some parts of Kenya to the India in particular, where there was rivalry of sultanates for suzerainty and for power, and they have used a large number of Ethiopians. The difference is, while slavery in the American Peninsula had brought in both male and female, slavery in Eastern Africa, over 99% is only men. Now, people think because of that, there has been a very close integration and assimilation of the people in the Indian Peninsula, whilst it has not taken place in the other places because they had their own female and male to work with. But anyway, that's the first factor I want to mention to you by way of the location of the country and the interaction that it has had. That's one major factor. The second major factor is the Nile Valley. How history, trade, interaction, cultural development has gone from southward, from Ethiopia towards Sudan and Egypt. Now that by itself is another interesting phenomena, an interesting development, and recent historical trends indicate, and this is something like, 10, 20 years now, that somehow from the Afar region, moving through Sudan and to Egypt, probably that's how ancient civilization moved, not from north southwards, but from these regions to the northern part. So let me just say the Nile Valley is the other factor. To most people, when they speak of the Nile, they speak of the water, which is important, no question. And let me simply say that close to 80–85% of the Nile water goes from Ethiopia and the rest from the other parts of Africa. So that's the second major factor. The third factor that I think played a very important role in the development of culture, education, literacy, civilizations within Ethiopia is how Ethiopia accepted the three major religions. You start with Judaism, which is long established in Ethiopia. The history of the Queen of Sheba to some people is a fable, to Ethiopians it's a reality. And that occurred, 900 years or so before Christ. And the story goes, as you know, I'm not going to repeat it, that the queen went to visit Solomon because of his wisdom, of his sagacity. And she, the Ethiopian historians tell us, tried him on all kinds of things and found him to be a wise man. She came with scholars from that part of the world. The idea being, Judaism was not forced on Ethiopia. Ethiopians went and invited it to come. The consequence is tremendous, but I will not move into it. Christianity, the same way, The story goes that around the 1st century, around 34, the minister of the treasurer of our Queen Hindake went to Jerusalem and on the way got baptized to be a Christian. He came and started introducing Christianity into Ethiopia. Here again, Christianity had not come as in many other parts of the world, including Africa, a white monk, which is the usual caricature, with his cross and his gun to enslave Ethiopia, to colonize Ethiopia. That isn't the experience that we had in Ethiopia. We went and asked for Christianity. So it is inside driven. The third major religion, which happened, 1600 years after Judaism came to Ethiopia, and after maybe 600 years or so Christianity got into Ethiopia, is Islam. And even in the coming of this religion, you know the story how Muhammad and his followers being persecuted while he was in the process of establishing himself, and sent some 80 of his followers to the king of Ethiopia in Aksum, and how the king received them, protected them, supported them, and sent them back when Muhammad got established. You all know that the first Bilal of Islam is an Ethiopian. You all know that one of the nurses that brought up Muhammad is an Ethiopian. There are some linguistic and other factors which corroborate this. I'm not going to go into that, but simply the conclusion of this part is the coming of major religions into Ethiopia. It is an inside voluntary introduction or movement, and not the other way around, which has been forced upon the people. And the interaction of these three religions on the language, on the life of the people, even on the politics of the country, which I'm not going to touch, is tremendous. But so anyway, this is another major third factor that I want you to keep in the back of your mind. And the fourth one that I want to mention is literacy, is the alphabet. That the Ethiopians, the monks in particular, who have been going to Jerusalem for a long time and otherwise created, we don't know who created it, but all indications are it's the Ethiopian monks that created the Ethiopian alphabet, and the consequence of that is upon our historical development is tremendous. So that's the first part I want you to keep in the back of your mind when you think about cultural development. I mean, I'm looking at education not in its narrowest sense. It's the broader cultural development that I think is important, including schooling. Now, let me go into the 4,000 years of history of education in Ethiopia. I just want you to keep in the back of your mind there are probably 5 broad area or divisions. The first part is the so-called traditional education. It's the education of the church, schooling by Muslim, Islamic education, and earlier, of course, Judaic education in Ethiopia. I mean, there are famous scholars in Ethiopia who have established themselves as scholars who speak Ge'ez, Hebrew, and Greek. And that to be a scholar in some parts of the Bible without knowing Ge'ez and Greek, or without knowing Ge'ez and Hebraic, was considered to be a kind of a second-class scholar. But that's all gone now, more or less. So you have a history of education. Largely, the Ethiopian church is the one that has influenced really the development of education in Ethiopia. The church somehow moved, as you know, from the north to the south. Education followed the establishment of the churches in Ethiopia. And that wherever there is a church, more or less there is a school. Not that all the churches have school. Not that all the schools were all the time attached to a monastery. But by and large, a large number of the schools followed the development and the expansion of the schools from north to south and west. We don't know how many churches there are in Ethiopia. There have been estimates. We think there are probably between 30 and 35,000 of them in the country in general. All the people who've done some thinking, Stilts, the German, Kidani, the Ethiopian, and the Ethiopian church itself, all think that there are probably between 30 and 35,000 churches, and there are probably over 10,000 to 15,000 schools around the country. And literacy, though restricted, though in terms of orientation and emphasis religious, but not exclusively religious, some legal training, and there have even been some important handcraft schools, calligraphy, and the school system has been established from, as you all know it now, from the beginning to a university level. And there were centers of excellence in which people who are to qualify as professors have to go through, even though they know the content, they had to spend a year or two in that particular monastery for that particular subject to qualify as a scholar and as a teacher. I'm not going to bother you with this. It's a very extensive area. And if you're interested, we can talk in detail about it. But I just want to say 2-3 things on this that I think are important. The first one is the tremendous contribution that Ethiopian monks have made to the development of education in Ethiopia. This is something that Ethiopians do not realize. We do not recognize the importance that these monks have made to the development of Ethiopian culture. Many of them have vanished in the deserts when there was no transportation. They had to walk the desert from Ethiopia to Sudan to Egypt. They had to go to Jerusalem. And many of them have died, have vanished. But a few that have survived have made tremendous scholarship contribution. They have gotten in touch with Greek scholars, gotten in touch with Italian scholars, gotten in touch with German scholars, and made tremendous contribution. You all know the famous Guidi, for instance, the Italian scholar who established Ethiopian studies in Italy, Ludolf in Germany. When you read the books that you read, you get the feeling as if that these scholars have made those contributions by themselves. But behind them, their teachers were these Ethiopian monks. They were the ones who taught them Greece. In the process, they learned German, they learned Italian, they learned French. And they are the ones who helped them understand the history of the culture. And some of the books that have been written and have introduced Ethiopia to the European world at that time were books that have been inspired and supported from behind by these monks. So that's the first element. I mean, there are names and names of these scholars that have gone there, that have made a tremendous contribution. And I just want to say this especially to my colleagues from Ethiopia, that if I were to pick a group of people that have made a tremendous contribution to Ethiopian cultural development, it is not the kings and the emperors. It is the monks that have, from a cultural perspective, these are the ones who have made a tremendous contribution to our development, at least from my perspective. So that's for the first period, that is the period of the church. That I think probably, let me leave it there. If you are in detail, I'll follow that. The second period is the introduction of modern education in Ethiopia. You know, modern education into Ethiopia came very late. Whilst we talk of the traditional education, which has taken place maybe for 20 to 30 centuries, modern education is 1 century. It's 1 century. After all, it's Emperor Menelik and Emperor Theodorus that have started the move. But largely, technically, it's Menelik that established the first public modern educational system in Ethiopia. And that is in 1900, which is 1 century. Following Emperor Menelik came, of course, Emperor Haile Selassie. I'm simplifying the period. He was a very energetic and probably, from my perspective, could be considered as the father of modern education in Ethiopia. That's Emperor Haile Selassie. I just completed reading some 270 speeches he made on education. And I tried to synthesize them. And it's amazing how some of the concepts he has are as modern as some of the books and some of the volumes that have been written at the World Bank and UNESCO and UNICEF. How did he get this education, these concepts? After all, he didn't go to a university, at best high school. Even that is doubtful. He's a self-taught man, but his period would be the period that I would consider probably the one that had the most impact in Ethiopia and the modernization process of Ethiopia. So the second period is the introduction of modern education. But as you know, that period was interrupted by the Italian occupation. The 5 period of the Italian occupation of Ethiopia did 2 things: interrupted the energetic development of education, and decimated, and the word is used advisedly, decimated, hand-picked, and killed the few educated Ethiopians that had been trained before the war. And so when the emperor came back after the Italian War, the Second World War still ongoing in the future, he found very few people, modern education, with education to start the educational system. So in fact, I just want to indicate to you that the history of modern education is some 75 years old. It's really started after the Italian War. So it's very young. It's very young. You could do many things in 75 years, but I'm talking about history. About history, not current events. That's the second period. Let's leave it. The third period is obviously the very important contribution, as I said, that the emperor made. And his contribution is fantastic. And he is the one who somehow had the idea that the only way to survive as a people, the only way to keep the dignity of Ethiopia as an independent nation, is to have educated people. And he wants to educate the people at any expense. And he sent people abroad, he pushed people abroad, all over, and in the process, he may have erred in the sense that when people came, they were too much westernized in quotes, and that in the process, they did not have the cultural context, and they had really not based the educational system in transforming the traditional education which had survived in Ethiopia for 20 centuries. And that's one major problem that we have, that as educators we have to take note of for the future development. So the emperor is the one who's credited for developing the colleges and the university. I was a student when the emperor came back after the war. I'm one of those few students that can say I started when the emperor came back. And the schools that we used, they were barracks that were used with the Italian army. We didn't have a Ministry of Education. We had a center. We didn't have trained teachers. And who were the teachers? Anybody that thinks knew something about either French speaking, English speaking, even Italian speaking, Amharic speaking, Arabic speaking, who wants to open a school was encouraged to open. We didn't have a center to give guidance. And so, and I mentioned that because when we begin to really think through why so many of our young people started going haywire in the higher education system, these are major factors that I think are intertwined. Okay. I think that's higher education in the fourth period is what you would call the revolution period. It's the period in which Ethiopia overthrew the monarchy, introduced a completely foreign religion. They want to replace Orthodox Church, the Muslim Church, with Marxism-Leninism. People don't like me say that. But the way it came, the way it was purported, the way it was presented, it was not presented as an idea, as an alternative, but almost as a religion. As a religion. Take it or leave it. And if you don't like it, you are the enemy. If you have a different idea, you are the enemy. But anyway, that's the fourth period. This is a period where the student movement was really tough. Let me say that by speaking of the student movement, we need to acknowledge both parts. There is no question that the one organized, consistent group that wanted to bring about change in Ethiopia were the students. This is true. This is true. This is historically true. But the students thought they knew everything. They even knew how to run a government. They even knew how to teach in a university. They even knew how to be a president of a university, how to be a dean of education, how to be a minister of education, how to be an administrator in our Raja. They knew it all. The consequence is disaster. That's the fourth period of Ethiopian history. And the last one is the period in which we are at the present time, largely characterized by ethnicization of the country. In broad terms, the current period has a positive side to it and a negative side to it. The positive side, the expansion of education, the improvement of educational opportunity is phenomenal. That has to be acknowledged. That is true. And that more people that did not have opportunity in the past have this opportunity now. The disaster is the approach that education is being developed now in very many senses is very sad. The quality is sad. Maybe I should not be the one to judge that because it's ongoing and we have yet to judge it in the future. But there is no question that the education has been too much politicized. Too much politicized. Education is a political venture, social phenomenon, we all know. We all know. I think the process of judging giving the necessary due position to educators and to people who know. And the political ideology, the balance between them is the one that will be able to judge whether our leaders really have given it due process. I think basically these are, I have probably just run over this whole process. So you have a period of the traditional education, the beginning of modern education, the Emperor Haile Selassie and his contribution, the revolution and its aftermath, and the current period. And what I want you to think about, and one area that we have left out and that I want to come back, is especially important as far as Africa goes and as far as Ethiopia also goes, and other societies, is often there is a tendency to equate education with schooling. And that's not true. African societies have lived, Ethiopian societies have lived, societies have their own ways of transferring themselves, their knowledge, their ideas, their upbringing, their reading practices through their children, through other ways, and they have done it very well. And we tend to neglect that part, meaning education, literary education. The non-literate societies, which has been wide, has been left out. And that we have made a big mistake. And this mistake I have experienced it in 1958. 1958, 2 years after I went back to Ethiopia, there was a general conference of UNESCO, a conference of UNESCO called the Mutual Appreciation of Eastern and Western Cultural Values. The Mutual Appreciation of Eastern and Western Cultural Values. The meeting took place in Cairo, 1958, and I went. I don't know how I went, but I was invited, I went. There were 2 Africans, an Egyptian and me, in that meeting. And I listened for 4 days, and Eastern meant Arab and Asia, Western meant Europe and America, and a young man, probably not tempered. So I said, where is Africa? Okay, where is Africa? And the answer came, we're talking about literate societies. So if you do not read or write, you don't have a history of education, don't have a culture to write. And so a movement started. It's a long story, and it's a story that Ethiopia has played a tremendous lot, and Ghana has played a tremendous lot, and Nigeria has played a tremendous lot, and later on Kenya has played a tremendous lot. We said that approach cannot continue in UNESCO. Africa has to be in it, and the mutual appreciation of Eastern and Western cultural values is lopsided, is prejudiced, and that something has to be done. This anyway ended in the major project, the General History of Africa, which you have now in 8 volume, General History of Africa. I happen to be the first president of the scientific committee of that committee. And that is how the African history really then started to be given due consideration. Again, I'm summarizing. I said that because even within Ethiopia, when we talk about the history of education, you have other societies within the country who may not be literary in that sense, but who have their own history. One area is the Gada system of the Oromo people. It's a very structured, ordered, organized system, And that's how the education took place. Let me stop here. If I go on, I probably would go on too much. I have been allotted only half an hour. I have taken more than half an hour. I'm sorry. I hope you have understood me, but if you don't, please ask questions. I will be happy to interact.
Thank you, Dr. Aklilu.
Thank you very much for your very illuminating lecture. I wanted to ask you, what are the trends now in education? What is the direction in which you see the university focusing on? What are the new trends in Ethiopia?
Well, let me first start by saying it's been a long time since I have been to Ethiopia. I have not gone to Ethiopia. I came to this country in 1977 when I joined the World Bank. Since then, I have gone a couple of times. And so all that I'm saying is maybe there are things within the country that I do not capture. So I want that out clear. But I do read what's going on in Ethiopia. I have lots of friends within UNESCO and UNICEF and the World Bank. So we keep in touch with what's going on in addition to Ethiopia. The trend is expansion, expansion, expansion. That's number one. Expansion is good. But education is education. There is a question of language, there is a question of content, the question of quality. That part has been neglected, and that worries me very much. On higher education, there is an interesting development. There was two universities when I was there. There's the university in Asmara, and there was the university in Addis Ababa. They tell me now that there are over 20 universities. The quality is a disaster. The quality is a disaster. I have been in touch with graduates that have come. I have talked with them. I have seen them. And honestly, I'm very much worried about the quality in that respect. But I hear that people are beginning to talk about quality being a problem. It should have been from the very beginning. The old school, the emperor started Haile Selassie University. We have sent probably to this country some 500 students that I know. And they have come here to some 85 universities. I'm now speaking just of America. We have sent students to Britain after graduation. We have sent students even to France. And do you know, there are only 2 students that didn't make it for graduate level education. And so in terms of standard, in terms of quality, my assumption is that somehow these people have done very well, very well. So the current trend is expansion. It's good to provide educational opportunity, but there needs to be some system. The issue of planning, the issue of managing higher education as higher education, it needs much more care than at present. In my opinion, as an Ethiopian, I'm very much worried. I'm very much worried as what is going on, even though I really applaud the efforts that expansion is taking place. Some people who probably do not understand the educational system are in charge because of their political affinity. That is the only thing I could guess. So the development is expansion, which is good, period. I'm sorry, but I'm very worried. I'm glad you asked this question to me because there is no doubt that people are coming out, graduating in hundreds. But what kind of people?
May I have a follow-up on this question? So you have addressed the idea of planning, but is there also the issue of the training of the professors? Is it also a matter of the selection of the curriculum?
Well,
the
well, at the primary level, I have the latest statistics from the Ministry of Education, which with me. And no question that the teacher-pupil ratio is a problem. But that anyway is all over. So it's not anything particular to Ethiopia, the teacher-pupil ratio. The question of teacher training at the primary level, I feel has improved, has expanded, has improved, in my opinion. My major worry is at the higher education level, the World Bank is involved, UNICEF is involved, and so other countries are involved. They all tell me that the issue of quality needs to be addressed. The training of professors, yes, there we have a problem. There I think the issue is a little bit more politicized. A large number of Ethiopians educated that could go and be useful to Ethiopia. Maybe many of them may not be acceptable for a variety of reasons, including politics. And I understand that teachers are being recruited from India and from Nigeria. It makes me sad. When we started the university, there were 30 Ethiopians teaching. When we finished, there were 545 university teachers. Of these, 60% were Ethiopians. How did this happen? Systematically recruiting some of the younger, brighter people, sending them abroad after 1 year of experience, and supporting them. I'm trying simply to say, at this stage of our development, there are qualified Ethiopians that could be utilized in a variety of ways. But that is a purely political issue. Well, agricultural development, I mean, the majority of the Ethiopian people are rural people. I mean, this is almost a cliche. It's almost a cliche. In any developing society, the majority of the people are rural people. And that the educational system we have established, if I were to criticize me as an educator, although I spent my life at higher level, but I think a major emphasis should have been made to impact the rural area. You may have heard of a program called the Ethiopia University Service. I don't know if you've heard. We were worried when I was at the university, the professors, all of us got together and said, what could we do? The books are written for an non-Ethiopian audience. The majority of the teachers come from outside of Ethiopia. How do we train these people to make them relevant to Ethiopian society, the current Ethiopian society? In the end, we have to train our own people. There is no substitute to it. This is a foregone conclusion. But that's going to take a long time. You train the people, it takes 4 years at the university level. You send them abroad, it probably takes 3-4 years for them to complete their studies, 8 years. They probably come, they need 3-4 years for a first experience, 12 years. For some people, this is even at elementary level. I'm not speaking of the sophisticated and the seasoned professor that has done research work, that has done exploratory work. This takes probably 15-20 years. So we have a first generation of people. So simply, we started this 1 year of university service in which we said every single university student at the end of his third year will go and serve 1 year in rural Ethiopia as a teacher. People didn't like it. At that time, I was at the beginning of it. We had our president at that time was Litkasa. And I don't want to go into the details, intricate detail, but we succeeded. The students went and served 1 year. We have follow-up studies, especially Francis Corton has done follow-up studies, and most of the students loved it, and they said it helped them know their country. A few students that have been politicized didn't like it. It's all right. So that was an attempt to see how people could go and appreciate the rural area of the people. If not solution, at least they would come knowing that there is a problem out there and that they feel it. So this was one attempt. So to answer your question, any attempt that that any government does by way of policy to develop an educational system to revitalize the rural area, I think is the right direction. The issue would be, what is the content? How relevant is it? Who is doing the teaching? How is this followed with the economic policy of the country, the land policy of the country? This needs to be looked into some care. Thank you. But just to say, you know, I'm not here I mean, I wish you would ask me that question. I would be happy to talk about for about an hour. Because this is a topic exactly that, but let me make sure that we are on the same wavelength. As far as the period of Emperor Haile Selassie, there is no question that educational opportunity has been limited, but educational system has been established from scratch. That's number one. The current system is benefiting from that built-up experience, which is now expanding. That's for sure. And don't forget that we're talking about a monarchy. We're not talking about a democratic form of government in which, I mean, so when we judge, we need to judge also within that context. That's the context that we need to establish. But one thing is sure, and that is a fact, and you'll find it when my book comes out. The emperor's contribution to Ethiopian society without any discrimination whatsoever. That part will be established. The concept of ethnicity is a current problem. I'm not saying that it didn't exist then, but the emperor never identified whether you are this or that tribe. Are you a good student? Are you a first-class student? Go. And the statistics prove it. Statistics prove it. The so-called aristocracy, there are a handful of people that have gone to England. We know them, about 112 people we're talking about. So, you know, I've studied this problem with some care, and the allegation that some people make that the emperor is making selectively, that's absolutely false. The statistics and the evidence will prove it. That part is you know, but your other point that we should not try to exaggerate the contribution of education that the emperor has made vis-a-vis the current issues is also correct, because sure, now the education system is much more expanded. Education opportunity has reached more people. This is history, you know. This is history. You built one on the other. As I said, he started from scratch. There was nobody at that time. He built a school system. And by the time he left, there was a large number of students that have a background, completed high school. When we started the university, there were not enough students from high school to go to the university. There were none. I mean, I could tell you, when we were trying to train secondary school teachers, we couldn't find, so we had to go from place to place and get people from grade 11 and give them special training. Now that problem is gone. In fact, we have hundreds of thousands of high school students that you can select from, But still, we are talking about a national development. We are talking about an educational development. We are talking about influencing the minds of youth, in that we need to pay some care how this mind is nurtured somehow, and that quality becomes a problem.
Our time. I think you can probably,
Yeah.
Dr. Aklilu will be happy to discuss with you privately because our time is up, 1 o'clock. And,
I'm sorry.
yeah. And thank you
I'm
so
sorry.
much, Dr. Aklilu. It's very informative, and I hope you can come back for further lectures. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.